History is not written in ink but in blood. It is a tapestry woven with threads of ambition, love, and betrayal, stained by the tears of the forgotten. In the silent, echoing halls of fallen kingdoms, stones remember what chronicles choose to erase. Tonight, we unearth one such story, a tale buried under the rubble of a once great dynasty, a story of a king consumed by his crown, a princess born to a fractured fate, and a queen whose love became the very blade that severed their legacy. This is the tragedy of the House of Alaric, a saga that reached its horrifying climax in the suffocating darkness of a single, fateful night. It is the story of a choice made in the heart of despair, a choice that would ignite a fire to burn down a kingdom and leave nothing behind but ashes and whispers. For in the grand theater of power, the most devastating betrayals are not born of hatred, but of a desperate, twisted love. This is the tale of the queen's betrayal at midnight. In the forgotten annals of the Eldorian kingdom, there lies a chapter so dark, so steeped in sorrow, that scribes dared not commit its full truth to parchment. They speak of a golden age that was, in reality, merely gilded rust destined to crumble. They mention a king, a queen, and a princess, a trinity that should have symbolized hope, but instead became a monument to ruin. The story begins, as so many tragedies do, with the promise of greatness, a promise that festered into a poison that seeped through the very stones of the royal palace. We must tread carefully into this past, for the air here is thick with the ghosts of broken oaths and the echoes of final screams. The narrative you are about to hear is not one of glory, but of the harrowing silence that follows a crown's fall. It is a chilling reminder that the walls of a palace can become a tomb, and that the heaviest burdens are not the jewels a monarch wears, but the secrets they carry to their grave. Join us as we journey back to a time of shadows and whispers, to uncover the agonizing truth of a family undone by the very power they sought to control. King Valerius was not a man born to the throne. He was a man who carved his path to it with a sword of cold, unforgiving steel. He emerged from the lesser nobility, a third son with no inheritance but a ferocious ambition that burned like a black fire in his soul. In his youth, he was a warlord, a brilliant strategist who saw the kingdom's weakness not as a problem, but as an opportunity. He amassed loyalty through fear and victory, promising stability to a land weary of civil strife. His ascent was a bloody staircase. Each step was the corpse of a rival, each landing a broken treaty. When the old, frail king died without a clear heir, Valerius seized his moment. He marched his legions into the capital, not as a liberator, but as a conqueror claiming his prize. The council, fearing his wrath, placed the heavy crown upon his head, but the crown did not grant him peace. It only amplified his paranoia, making him see daggers in every shadow and poison in every cup. He had won the kingdom, but the fear of losing it, the same way he had taken it, became a cancer in his mind, twisting his rule from one of strength into one of pure, suffocating tyranny. To soften the iron grip of his reign and legitimize his blood-soaked claim, King Valerius sought a queen from a land of ancient lineage and respected diplomacy. That queen was Ilara of Seraphina. She was a stark contrast to her husband. Her strength was not in the sword, but in her quiet grace and profound wisdom. Her beauty was spoken of in hushed, reverent tones, but it was her mind that was her true power. She arrived at the court like a breath of spring in a harsh, unending winter, her presence a balm to the terrified nobility. Ilara believed she could temper the king's brutal nature, that her counsel could steer the kingdom towards prosperity rather than perpetual conflict. For a time, it seemed she might succeed. She championed the arts, funded orphanages, and her gentle diplomacy mended alliances her husband's aggression had shattered. The people came to adore her, seeing in her the heart the kingdom desperately lacked. But she was a dove in a cage of vipers, and her wisdom was a light that only made the palace's encroaching shadows appear darker and more menacing. She was the kingdom's hope, a fragile candle flame destined to be extinguished by the very storm she sought to calm. In the third year of their uneasy union, a new light flickered into existence within the cold stone walls of the citadel, Princess Aurelia. Her birth was a rare moment of genuine celebration, a brief respite from the kingdom's undercurrent of fear. To the people, she was a symbol of a brighter future, a blend of her mother's grace, and they hoped, a tempered version of her father's strength. For Queen Alara, Orlia was everything, a reason to endure the king's darkening moods, a pure and innocent soul to protect from the court's poison. Even King Valerius, a man seemingly carved from granite, softened in his daughter's presence. He saw in her not just a child, but the continuation of his legacy, the bloodline that would cement his name in history forever. The sound of the princess's laughter echoed through corridors that had long grown accustomed to silent dread. She was the kingdom's shared treasure, a delicate flower blooming on the edge of a precipice. But innocence in a place of power is a vulnerability, a pawn in a game it does not understand. Princess Aurelia was the heart of the kingdom, and it is the heart that is always the first to be targeted in a war of shadows. The brief warmth brought by Princess Aurelia's birth soon chilled. King Valerius's paranoia, which had lain dormant, returned with a vengeance. He trusted no one. His council was filled with sycophants who whispered poison in his ear, turning him against loyal generals and wise advisors. Envy festered in the court. Nobles who felt cheated by Valerius's rise began to conspire in candlelit chambers, their ambitions sharpened by the king's instability. Queen Alara, with her intelligence and popular appeal, was seen as a threat by many, including the king's most trusted commander, Lord Malachi, a man whose loyalty was a mask for his own insatiable greed. Whispers became the true currency of the realm, whispers of the king's madness, of the queen's foreign influence, of plots to seize the throne. The very air in the palace grew heavy, suffocating. Every rustle of silk sounded like a drawn blade, every closed door concealed a potential conspiracy. The kingdom was a finely balanced scale, and unseen hands were now adding stones to one side, waiting for the moment it would all come crashing down. The shadows were no longer just in the corners, they were lengthening, reaching for the throne itself. A man who conquers a throne rarely knows how to sit on it in peace. King Valerius was haunted by the idea that his legacy would be that of a mere usurper. To silence these ghosts, he embarked on a ruinous quest for absolute power and immortal glory. His ambition became a ravenous beast, devouring the kingdom's wealth, its men, and its soul. He levied impossible taxes on his people to fund pointless wars against imagined enemies, his desire for new territories bordering on madness. Fields lay fallow as farmers were conscripted into his ever-growing army. The royal treasury, which Queen Alara had carefully helped to restore, was bled dry for monuments to his own greatness. He ignored her pleas for reason, her warnings that the kingdom was fracturing from within. His vision had narrowed to a single point. His name, etched into history, larger than any who had come before. His love for his daughter, Princess Aurelia, also warped into a tool of his ambition. He began negotiating her betrothal to the cruel son of a barbarian king, a pact that would grant him soldiers but would surely condemn his only child to a life of misery. Power had ceased to be a means to an end. It was the end itself, and he was willing to sacrifice anyone, even his own family, at its altar. Behind the serene facade she presented to the court, Queen Alara was drowning in a sea of silent despair. Her marriage had become a prison, her husband a stranger with eyes of ice. Her counsel was dismissed, her influence eroded by the venomous whispers of Lord Malachi and his cronies. She walked the palace halls like a ghost, her every move watched, her letters intercepted. Her nights were sleepless, spent packing the cold floors of her chamber, praying for a way to save her people and, above all, her daughter. The king's plan to marry Princess Aurelia to a brute was the final, unbearable blow. Alara looked at her innocent child, still unaware of the horrific fate being arranged for her, and saw the future collapsing into a nightmare. Her pain was a secret she bore alone, a crushing weight that stole the light from her eyes. She shed her tears in the solitude of the royal chapel, where no one could see the cracks forming in her perfect composure. It was in this crucible of fear and desperation that a terrible resolve began to form, a decision that went against her every instinct as a queen, but one she felt was her only choice as a mother. If the king would not listen to her words, perhaps a more drastic action was needed to save the kingdom from his madness. Princess Aurelia grew up in a world of beautiful contradictions. She lived in a palace of breathtaking splendor, yet felt the cold chill of fear that clung to its walls. She was adored by her mother and possessively loved by her father, yet she was fundamentally alone, a gilded bird in a cage she did not yet recognize. Her tutors taught her of glorious history and noble lineages, but not of the brutal political machinations that were deciding her future. To her, Lord Malachi was just a stern man who never smiled. She could not see the serpent coiling behind his eyes. She knew her father was the king, a powerful man who made thunderous decrees, but she could not comprehend the depth of his paranoia or the cruelty of his ambition. As she blossomed from a child into a young woman, the cage began to shrink. Her freedom to roam the gardens was curtailed. Her lessons shifted from poetry to the grim realities of dynastic alliances. The news of her impending betrothal was delivered to her not as a proposal, but as a sentence. She was a piece on a board, the most valuable and most vulnerable, being moved by forces of greed and desperation in a game where her own happiness was the first sacrifice. Her fragile destiny was being woven by others, and the pattern was one of inescapable tragedy. Driven to the edge, Queen Alara began a desperate search for anything that could give her leverage against the king, a way to stop the monstrous alliance and save her daughter. She did not know what she was looking for, perhaps a forgotten law, a hidden debt. What she found was infinitely worse. In a secret compartment behind the royal library's oldest tapestry, a place known only to the former dynasty, she discovered a small, iron-bound chest. Inside was a letter, written in the trembling hand of the old king's dying physician. It was a confession. King Valerius had not simply seized an empty throne. The old king's chosen heir, his nephew, had not died of a sudden fever as the official history claimed. He had been poisoned, slowly and meticulously, on Valerius's direct orders. The king was not just a usurper. He was a kinslayer, a murderer who had built his reign upon the most heinous of crimes. The truth struck Alara with the force of a physical blow. The man she was married to, the father of her child, was a monster wearing a crown. This secret was the spark that lit the fuse. Her betrayal, she now realized, was not a betrayal at all. It was justice. Armed with this terrible knowledge, she summoned the one man she believed she could trust, a rival of Lord Malachi who also feared the king's descent into madness. The plot was hatched. The chosen night was starless, cloaked in a brewing storm that mirrored the tempest about to be unleashed within the palace walls. The signal was a single, silenced toll from the chapel bell at the stroke of midnight. Queen Alara, her heart a frantic drum against her ribs, waited in her chambers as the coup began. Her co-conspirators, a faction of knights loyal to the old dynasty, moved through the palace corridors like wraiths. But the rebellion she had envisioned as a swift, precise surgical strike, the king captured, forced to abdicate, degenerated into a chaotic bloodbath. Lord Malachi, ever the opportunist, had gotten wind of a plot, though he knew not who led it. He had doubled the king's personal guard. The palace became a slaughterhouse. Loyalists fought rebels in the torchlit halls, their battle cries and death screams echoing off the marble. Tapestries were torn, priceless artifacts shattered. The pristine floors were slick with the blood of men who, only hours before, had been comrades. The carefully laid plan had shattered into 1,000 pieces of brutal, uncontrolled violence. Alara had wanted to save the kingdom from a tyrant, but in her desperation, she had merely plunged it headfirst into the very heart of anarchy and bloodshed. The throne was falling, but it threatened to pull everyone down with it. Amid the chaos, King Valerius was cornered in the great throne room. He stood like a wounded lion, sword in hand, surrounded by the bodies of his guard. It was then that Queen Alara entered, her face pale but resolute. For a fleeting moment, the fighting ceased as all eyes turned to the royal couple. In that terrible silence, Valerius looked at his wife, saw the faction of knights behind her, and the truth crashed down upon him. The betrayal was not from some distant cousin or ambitious general. It was from her. The look in his eyes was not just rage, but a profound, soul-shattering agony. "You," he choked out, the word barely a whisper. He lunged, not at the knights, but at her. He was a king no more, just a man undone by the one person he had, in his own twisted way, perhaps trusted. Before anyone could react, he drove his blade into her, his face a mask of anguish and fury. Alara crumpled to the floor, a gasp escaping her lips. Her last sight was not of a kingdom saved, but of the horrified face of the man she had tried to depose, and the spreading crimson stain on her gown. Her plan had failed in the most catastrophic way imaginable. She died on the cold stone floor, at the foot of the very throne she had sought to cleanse. The queen's murder broke whatever was left of King Valerius. The fire in his eyes died, replaced by a hollow, vacant emptiness. He dropped his bloodied sword with a clang that echoed the finality of his reign. The rebel knights, enraged by the slaughter of the queen they had intended to install as regent, seized him without a fight. His downfall was as swift and brutal as his rise. He was not granted a quick death. The new self-proclaimed council, led by the very men Alara had allied with, paraded him through the capital city. They stripped him of his royal finery, forcing him to walk in rags through the same streets where he had once ridden in triumph. The people, who had lived in fear of him, now hurled stones and insults, their pent-up hatred released in a torrent of fury. He was brought before a makeshift tribunal and condemned not just for his tyranny, but for the murder of the queen the people had loved. His execution was a public spectacle, a grim and bloody warning to all future tyrants. As the axe fell, his last breath was not a curse, but a broken whisper of his wife's name. His ambition had led him to a crown, but it was his broken heart that led him to the block. In the terrifying aftermath, the fate of the 9-year-old Princess Aurelia was debated in the shadows by the new rulers. The queen's final plea to her allies had been to protect her daughter at all costs. It was a promise they had no intention of keeping. To them, Aurelia was not an innocent child. She was the last remnant of Valerius's bloodline, a living symbol around whom loyalists could rally. She was a threat. To execute a child would be seen as monstrous, so they chose a fate they deemed more merciful but was in truth infinitely crueler. In the dead of night, guards stormed her chambers. They ignored her terrified sobs, pulling her from her bed and dragging her deep into the labyrinthine dungeons beneath the palace. They did not take her to a cell, but to a long-forgotten wing of the catacombs. There, in a small, windowless room containing only a cot and a bucket, they left her. The heavy iron door was sealed, its lock rusted shut from the outside. They told the world the princess had died of grief. They struck her name from the royal records, erasing her from history itself. Princess Aurelia, the symbol of hope, was buried alive in silence and stone, left to waste away, her cries for her mother and father heard by no one but the uncaring darkness. The kingdom of Eldoria did not heal. The men who seized power proved to be just as greedy and ruthless as the king they had overthrown. The civil war Alara had tried to prevent erupted with even greater ferocity, tearing the nation apart for a generation. The great palace, once a symbol of power, became a hollow shell, its halls haunted by the tragedy they had witnessed. The throne room where the queen had died was sealed, left to dust and decay. The story of the betrayal at midnight was twisted and rewritten by the victors. King Valerius was remembered only as a blood-mad tyrant. Queen Alara was painted as a foolish, ambitious woman whose actions doomed them all. And Princess Aurelia was simply forgotten. A footnote in a doctored history, a lost child who vanished in the chaos. The kingdom itself eventually crumbled, conquered by its neighbors who preyed on its weakness. All that remains today are the ruins, a skeleton of a once mighty nation, and the faint, sorrowful whisper on the wind, a story of how a king's ambition, a queen's desperation, and a princess's stolen future led to nothing but an empire of ashes and a legacy of silence. What is the lesson in the ashes of the House of Alaric? It is a stark and painful one. It is that in the deadly game of thrones there are no winners, only varying degrees of loss. It is a testament to how the road to hell can be paved with the best of intentions. A mother's love, twisted by desperation, can become as destructive as a tyrant's hate. The story of Valerius, Ilara, and Aurelia serves as a chilling monument to the corrupting nature of absolute power, how it devours love, reason, and innocence, leaving a vacuum of sorrow in its wake. Their tragedy is not unique. It is a pattern repeated endlessly throughout the darkest corridors of our past. A king's fear, a queen's choice, a child's fate, all consumed by the insatiable hunger of a crown. Their names may be lost to time, their faces faded from portraits, but their pain is eternal, absorbed by the very stones that witnessed their fall. The silence that now blankets their kingdom is the most honest historian of all, telling a story not of dates and battles, but of human hearts broken by the weight of destiny. History bleeds, and its echoes are written in the cries of kings, queens, and lost princesses. This was the Fear Room. Don't forget to subscribe and like for more dark history tales.